We would like to thank you for joining us for the 14th edition of the Annual Investment Meeting webinar series. My name is Prashant Udrani, conference producer for AIM, and I'll be your MC for today. The Annual Investment Meeting is the largest investment platform in the world, an initiative of the UAE Ministry of Economy. AIM has been promoting a healthy global economy by linking investment opportunities to fast-growing economies under 6 key pillars: foreign direct investment, foreign portfolio investment, small and medium enterprise, startups, and future cities, with a special event, One Belt, One Road. We would like to thank our multilateral partner, Islamic Cooperation for the Development of the Private Sector, for sponsoring today's webinar. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. If you experience any issue with your audio or video during the webinar, just refresh your browser and that should take care of everything. We would suggest using Chrome, Firefox, or Opera. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the question box in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If the question is addressed to a particular speaker, please do mention their name at the start of the question. If you like a specific question, vote for it under the question tab so we can address it to our speakers. In the panel discussion today, we will cover the topic social debt finance. Our speakers will be covering the following points: explore the world of social debt, discuss the potential of social debt, assess whether the recent scaling up will be maintained, address some of the challenges of social debt, including impact measurement. I would now like to introduce the moderator for today's webinar, Mr. Keith Mullen. Keith is the founder and director of Capital Markets Ltd, a media and thought leadership consultancy focused on capital markets, investment banking, financial markets, social and sustainable finance, and financial regulation. Keith has spent over 35 years in specialist capital market media during a fascinating period of innovation and change. He's also a renowned commentator, writer, columnist, and blogger. He'll be joined by a panel of experts. Keith, I would request you to please take it from here.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, Prasant. And let me add my welcome to you all to this social debt finance webinar. One of the remarkable benefits of doing these sort of things via the internet is that we have people dialing in from all over Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Africa, as well as the Americas. So that's truly impressive, a truly global showing. As Prashant said, we'll be discussing social debt finance. And I think just at the very beginning, I'd like to just clarify what we are talking about, what we're not talking about. So what we're really focusing on today is the social debt, or debt issued for social purposes, issued into the institutional capital markets. We're not today talking about social impact bonds, which many of you will know are bonds with a social purpose, but where returns are contingent on targets being met and adjudicated by third parties. It's a very interesting market, but that's not part of our discussion today. And so I'm absolutely delighted to have a great panel with me as we discuss the various aspects of the institutional social capital markets. And I think it's fair to say that that while the social DCM have actually had a longer shelf life than the kind of their green cousin, given that the first social labeled bonds, I guess, is widely seen to be the first bond issued by the International Finance Facility for Immunization back in November 2006. So we've had issues pretty much every year since then. But since the kind of explosion of environmental debt capital markets activity, social has slightly fallen by the wayside. It's only in the last 2 months, with the onset of a fair amount of COVID-19 related bonds, that social has really kind of taken its place on the stage. So one of the issues that we're discussing is, okay, you know, where does the social bond market go from here? what are the things that we've achieved, where are we going from here? And, I think one of the issues that strikes me as being very interesting is that, and potentially a hindrance that we'll see, is that social bonds to date have been issued not just for healthcare, but for affordable housing, microfinance, gender issues, unemployment, social inclusion, poverty reduction, food security, and socioeconomic betterment, and certain proceeds in support of United Nations SDG goals. So it's a really wide range of use of proceeds. Again, the last few weeks, I've been looking very carefully at the bonds that have been issued into the international markets. And if we include labelled bonds issued under the social bond principles, labelled bonds not issued under the social bond principles, unlabelled bonds where the issuer has stated certain social use of proceeds, which includes a lot of the sovereign bonds that have been issued in direct response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then earlier in the crisis, there was a lot of epidemic and control bonds issued into the Chinese domestic market, which had nominal use of proceeds that were geared towards mitigating impacts of COVID-19, but where the sort of proof of concept in terms of tracking was really not really front of mind. So anyway, that's it from me. We've got a great panel, as I mentioned. Let me introduce the panel to you now. Delighted to have Farnam Bidgoli from HSBC, where she is EMEA Head of Sustainable Bonds. Simone Utermarck from the International Capital Markets Ltd, where she's Director of Sustainable Finance. And Jens Hellerup, who's a Senior Director and Head of Funding at the Nordic Investment Bank. So a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you so much for your time today. Before we get into the kind of the thematics and the narrative, perhaps I'd like to invite each of you just to talk a little bit about your organizations. So Simone, if you could talk about the ICMA, Jens, the NIB. I think Farnam, you potentially have the advantage that most people know what HSBC is, but if you can talk about sustainable bonds within HSBC and what you're trying to achieve there. So let me invite you, if I may, Simone, just to talk a little bit about the ICMA.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much to AIM Congress for inviting me to this. So ICMA is actually stands for the International Capital Market Association, and we are a not-for-profit membership association, and we serve the needs of the wide range of member firms in the global capital markets. So at the moment, we have around 600 members in 62 countries. And members are, from the private and also public sectors, which means we have some private public sector issuers, banks, security houses, asset managers, and also other investors, capital market infrastructure providers like exchanges, for example, central banks, law firms, and others. The reason I'm here, I guess, today is ICMA also for years now has been managing the secretariat for the Green and Social Bond Principles, as well as for the Sustainability Bond Guidelines. So we're going to talk a bit more during this over the coming session, but this is just for background for you. Thank you.
Good, thanks so much, Simone. And Jens, tell us about the Nordic Investment Bank.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting me as well. So the Nordic Investment Bank, we are supranational, owned by the 5 Nordics and the 3 Baltic countries. We have that the mandate is to create a prosperous and sustainable Nordic-Baltic region. We can finance basic projects under 2 pillars. One is that we should finance projects which will improve the productivity, and the other one is that we should finance projects which will benefit the environment. So in fact, we have been a big green bond issuer for many years. Besides like this mandate, and in fact, we can also have a stabilizing role during economic crisis, and that was in fact what happened in March, where the Board of Governors in fact asked NIB to finance projects which will be affected by the pandemic COVID virus, and this is the reason in fact that we have issued a response bond, but I think we'll come back to that a little bit later.
Good, thank you. And Farnam, talk about, perhaps if you could, sustainable bonds within HSBC.
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, HSBC is active in sustainable finance and sustainable bonds in a number of different ways. We're actually an issuer of sustainable bonds. We've issued green and sustainability bonds to date in both bond and sukuk format. We're an investor in green, social, and sustainable bonds, both through our asset management team. And we also just launched a fund alongside the IFC for focusing on emerging market corporates. And finally, within our debt capital markets team, we're an underwriter of green, social, and sustainability bonds. And that's what my team focuses on in particular, supporting our debt capital markets clients on structuring green, social, and sustainable bonds in line with the ICMA guidelines, and ensuring that they're going to market with the most robust and credible frameworks.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So let's get into our conversation. Actually, I'm going to stay with you if I may, Farnam. I mentioned in my introduction that we've seen a lot of COVID-19 related bonds issued in response to the pandemic. But I'd like to perhaps go back to before that period of time, because I think it's just always good to set the context, perhaps, before the crisis. Can you talk about the social bond market as you saw it in 2019 and into the beginning of 2020? How would you characterize it?
So I think you're absolutely right to point out that whilst we've had social bonds in the market over the past 10 years, they were a much smaller part of the market until this year. If you look at 2019 issuance, green bonds made up about 80% of total issuance. Sustainability bonds, which combine both green and social use of proceeds, probably would estimate to be about 11%, and then the remainder coming from social bonds, the majority of which was coming from multilateral development banks and national development banks in the public sector side. So social bonds for a long time, whilst we've had the social bond principles since 2015, so we have had credible market guidance. They've been the smallest part of the market, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, particularly when you look at the private sector, identifying and monitoring social expenditures is a much more challenging undertaking than on the green side. It's really easy to identify, for instance, renewable energy generation or green buildings, these large, big ticket expenditures for use for the allocation of proceeds of a green bond. It's much more challenging when you look at aspects like social, because outside of, I would say, affordable housing and SME finance, having a large enough portfolio of expenditures is a challenge for a lot of issuers. And the second reason, I think, was on the reporting side and being able to demonstrate impact. This is something that, again, is not as straightforward as it is on the green side, where we have a clear metric in the form of GHG emissions avoidance. That is the one that investors are looking for and the one that issuers are tracking. And so the consistent concern that we had from our clients when thinking about social bonds was, well, how do I really show that I'm social enough, and how do I report that to the market?
Yeah, that's good points. And Simone, the International Capital Markets Ltd, as you mentioned, it runs a secretariat for both the green and social bond principle and sustainability guidelines as well. In terms of the kind of conversations that you have internally about the social bonds, and obviously there's a social bonds working group and various subcommittees of that as well. So it's a very big part of the work, the sustainability work that the ICMA is doing. What are the kind of topics that have come up internally, perhaps just feeding off of what Farnam was saying?
Yeah, thank you. So Farnam actually mentioned a couple of things already, because she's also part of our social bond working group. So the social bond principles were developed in 2017. Before that, we've had the green bond principles already, and then 2017 we came out with the, or actually we came out in 2018 then, after they were developed, with the social bond principles and then also the sustainability bond guidelines. Now, social bond principles obviously focus on social. Sustainability are a mix between social and green, and we see in the market that quite often the ratio is 3/4 green, 1/4 social. Otherwise, sometimes it's the other way around. It's really up to the issuer to decide that. Now, the social bond working group they haven't just sat back and done nothing since those principles came out. In fact, they're continuously looking at how to improve this. And also, we've seen a lot of issuance and we've seen a massive surge in the green bonds market. But social bonds, although we've seen remarkable increase since 2017 when we've developed the SBPs, as we call them, up until now, you could say they've always been sort of the poor little cousin of the green bonds, or the little sister, if you will. So this year we've seen a lot of issuance. And the social bond working group is actually, continuously thinking about how can we bring more institutions to issue social bonds. We've obviously seen a lot of sovereigns, supranational agencies, a lot of the multilateral banks that have also been at the forefront of issuing green bonds have been there. But we need to see more financial institutions, more corporates. And they're continuously working on revising, the guidance. For example, Farnam already alluded to the impact reporting. There's guidance handbooks out there that are just, in addition to the principles, they give practical guidance to issuers how to apply the principles. So I should also mention the principles have 4 core components. So they're voluntary process guidelines. The 4 core components are use of proceeds. The second one is the process for project evaluation and selection. Then there is project management, and there is reporting. And within the reporting component, the impact reporting is very important. And it's also then advised that the alignment with an issuer's social bond framework with those components is actually going to be verified by an external review, which can take various shapes or forms. The most prominent in the market are so-called SPOs, which are second-party opinions. I'll stop here. I guess I can elaborate a bit more on individual things
very
throughout
good.
the course.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Simone. And Jens, let me come to you. So you mentioned in your brief intro about NIB what you are and what you do, and obviously you're a supranational organization, and Bondish were a fairly active Bondish were, I think, and you have, which I guess you'll talk about, you have issued this year response bonds. But I was very curious because you almost studiously avoided calling them social bonds, even though to an outside observer, the basic tenets of what you're trying to achieve look quite similar, and in fact the 4 channels that Simone talked about kind of feed into your response framework. So 2 things. Could you really talk about, as an issuer, how you view the social bond market and why you chose specifically to do a response framework and not a social framework?
Okay, maybe I start with the second question first. So as I said, it was based the governors who asked NIB to respond to this COVID-19, and for these reasons we set up the response bond framework where we try to finance projects which will elevate the social and economy impact of the COVID-19. And it is true, we are following the 4 principles as Simone just mentioned. And yeah, I don't know, if we could but we don't think it's completely aligned with the social bond principle. We think the target for this bond is some kind of short-term crisis situations, and maybe not a long-term social issue. So we don't want to violate the integrity of the social bond principle and just be accused for social washing. So this is the main reasons that we don't say it's a social bond, and it's not so aligned with the social bond principle. Now we are also a member of the EMEA, and in fact we are the EXCOM committee, and in fact our head of treasury is chairing the steering committee of the EMEA social and green bonds committee, the executive committee. So we don't want to violate the integrity, and that's why we came with the response bond framework, which is to some extent finance the social issues, but we would just say we are not aligned with the. Then maybe just shortly on the second question, could we do a proper social bond? We will need longer time because this came quite fast. We based the framework up over a long weekend. But if we now would like to have a fully social bond program, we will need to have the second opinion or some verifications, and that will take longer time. We believe we have some of we have projects which will could be financed by a social bond, especially like on the productivity part of the mandate, where we see hospitals, schools, SMEs, and so on. In fact, if you look at the sustainable goals, where some of the projects within the social bonds could be financed, so those ones we have not finally decide if we want to issue a social bond. We are a frequent issuer, but we of course not the biggest in the world. And now we have green bonds, which we have been issuing for nearly 10 years. We have blue bonds and we have this response. So can we categorize everything into a special bond? And that's the discussions we have here at NIB. Should we set up the social bond aligned with the social bond principle?
Okay. If you did a social bond, do you have the full set of labelled issuance? Not many have done blue bonds, and you did a blue bond last year, so that would be neat.
Well, the blue bond is in fact part of the NIP environmental bonds, which is our name for the green bonds. So then we have the social. If we have the social, then we have the social and green. Then you can still think like, do we have something under the link bonds and sustainability bonds? So there is a lot of names discussed now within EMEA on different guidelines and principles. But again, like, we are not the biggest issuer in the world, so I don't think we can do everything.
That's completely reasonable. Farnam, the kind of the S word came up already, social washing. And you know, I don't think issuers go out with express purpose of trying to commit some kind of investor fraud on use of proceeds. I don't think that's necessarily what. Why would they? But it's certainly a notion worth pondering, because, and you kind of mentioned it also in your comments as well. When you raise finance to fund social programs, let's say it's unemployment, or social betterment. These are concepts. Well, social betterment is almost a concept. We know what it is, and we kind of more or less know it when we see it. But measuring it and tying specific use of proceeds to specific social betterment metrics is incredibly hard. So when you perhaps think about, internally within HSBC, and then when you talk to issuers, is this kind of a big stumbling block to get over? The measurement of impact I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's something that a lot of issuers struggle with. There's a couple of points that, within the social bonds working group, we've put out guidance, and I think it's really helpful to look at that guidance and think about how it applies to different organizations, because essentially, the guidelines provide a lot of points around different points of transparency that should be included in reporting. But one of the key points is differentiating between output versus outcome. And I think your question points to the fact that with outcome reporting, it could be longer term reporting. It can be a little bit more nebulous in terms of defining a direct impact. But most issuers can start by reporting on output. And the key metric we think is really the number of beneficiaries. And I think it's really interesting to look at, a lot of organizations that consider themselves to be inherently social. We have the example, for instance, of social housing associations, but don't actually report on the number of beneficiaries of their expenditures and of their assets and projects. And so even just that one step, being a little bit more transparent about that one step, I think is something that's really appreciated on the investor side and really useful in order to be able to help them in terms of comparing different issuers and looking about different social bond frameworks.
Yeah. Simone, can I ask you the similar question? I mean, I guess these topics must come up, I'm assuming, within the various committees and working groups that ICMA coordinates and sits on. And you've actually issued, since the pandemic, you issued some, a Q&A and some updated guidelines. Perhaps, I guess there's two questions really, but can you talk about what you've done really in the last few weeks to just clarify and just provide guidance on this issuance? And I do keep coming back to this issue about how difficult it is to actually assess, evaluate, measure, and so on in using hard metrics, social outputs.
Yeah, so indeed, we've been very busy, and because we have, as we've already clarified, we've seen a surge in social bonds this year, and I think about 70% or so has been due to social bonds or other self-labeled bonds or unlabeled bonds having been issued with a COVID-19 theme. And indeed, end of March, the GBP SBP XCOM, supported by ICMA, has come out with a statement saying that if you want to issue a social bond, then the social bond principles and the sustainability bond guidelines are immediately available. They're out there. We just want to let you know that they can be used. If you already have a social bond framework, you can use that if it already covers activities that would be covered under COVID-19. If not, you can update that framework. Or otherwise, it's not a requirement to have issued a social bond before, for example. So, but nevertheless, we actually want to emphasize that to us, a social bond should only be called a social bond if it's aligned to the SBP. We clearly realize that there have been a lot of relief bonds, for example, out there that were COVID-19 themed, to address the pandemic. And that's absolutely fine. They're not bad bonds. They're all good bonds. They're just not social bonds. So we really want to emphasize that to keep the integrity of the product. We've not just issued that emphasizing that the guidelines and principles are there. We've also, in addition, to address COVID-19, we have published Q&A, because there are specific questions around that. I've already mentioned that, a question that comes up a lot, can I just issue one if I already have a social bond framework? So these are questions and answers that we specifically addressed there, and it can be found on our website. And we've also published specific case studies that the IFC has put together. Because as I mentioned before, there just haven't been a lot of corporations yet. We've seen a lot of SSAs, multilaterals, but those case studies are specifically there to show corporates in, for example, the manufacturing space or the pharmaceutical space, and also for financial institutions, to give them some examples as to what they could issue, social bonds addressing COVID-19 for. And one of the things that I'd like to mention as well, as Farnam already said before, it's kind of difficult sometimes, because just to give you a definition of a social bond is a bond where the proceeds are there to address or mitigate a social issue or to aim to achieve a positive social outcome. And then in addition to that, it should be aimed at a target population, which is something you don't have for green bonds. And normally, there's a lot of debates going on, because, what counts as a social issue, or what is the target population? Obviously, sometimes for investors as well, it's easier to see what is the social issue in a developing market, for example, or an emerging market, or a less developed country, but not so much in a developed market. And then also with the target population, it's quite difficult to define sometimes. Now with COVID-19, it's obviously something that is a health issue that has socioeconomic consequences globally. So everyone sees there's a social issue. And then also the target population is, of course, quite often just the general populace. Nevertheless, though, even if it is the general populace, what we advise in our, also what we said end of March, is that issuers should make the link when they bring out a social bond framework for this. They should still make a link to what is the target population and how is this going to help them.
Indeed. Jens, beyond that, look, I think we can all agree that whether it's green or social sustainable, this notion of capital markets, doing something for the good of societies in which they live is fine. It's fantastic, and I think it should be encouraged. From an initial perspective, you have a, you want to maximize, you want to minimize your cost of funds, shall I say. Is labeled issuance a way to actually reduce your funding costs? In other words, I guess, have you noticed any change when you've done environmental bonds versus your, let's say, your normal benchmarks?
I think like if you sit down and say like, do we say 1 basis point or something like that? I think that's very difficult, and you can maybe argue you can say 1 or 2 basis points. I think what's much more important is that the trend among investors nowadays is not only risk and return. There is coming a third dimension in, and that is where is your money going? It started maybe like 10 years ago with the green bonds. So where you want to have an effect on your CO2, you don't want. So that was the starting point. Now it has become much broader. You would like to. There is something you're not allowed to do. You want to have some sustainability. You start even looking at the issuer, not only looking at the bond, what is the financing. So I think it's you're accessing much more investors. So the diversifying your investor base will improve. And I think this is the trend we are going anyway. So we need to prepare for it. And now, of course, we have done the green for many years. We have seen a lot of new investors, but even investors who would not categorize themselves as green, they have much more interest in a green bond. And I think that's maybe 3 years ago with our green bonds, that was very much dedicated to special green bonds investors. The last one, now we did a green bond, in fact, also a month ago. Here we see a much broader investor base than we used to see. So this is the way you need to go. And you can see the next step is that maybe not green or social bond, but is that like more an ESG assessments of the issuer. And I think the green and the social bond and an issuer prepare for that. In fact, align the whole organizations that you basically align your ESG internally and what you do and the things in your whole business. So I think that's also where we'll go going forward. But I like on a basis point, you can say like maybe like 1 basis point or 2 basis points compare. We don't have like a market where we issue both a green and a non-green. But I can see from some of our peers who has that, you can maybe say 1 basis point. But I don't think that's the main point here.
Understood. So, Farnam, I suspect this is an issue that comes up pretty much every day of your life when you're talking to investors. To Jens's point, I mean, there are clearly there's the investors are much more focused perhaps now than you ever have been on where the money goes. But at the same time, they want to maximize returns. And so, I mean, we all have been to dozens and dozens and dozens over the years of green bond conferences. You ask an investor, will you forgo return just because you know their money is going to a good place? They'll say, and recently, why should I? So, what's the trade-off here between, putting money to work for social and environmental good, but at the same time, if I'm basically putting money with and I'm investing for my pension, I don't particularly want to have a sort of lower return just for the sake of putting it to good use. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, I think that last point is really the key one here. And what we hear from investors is that they cannot, fill out an RFP anymore or win a mandate anymore without talking about environmental and social issues. And there was some really interesting research that came out recently from BlackRock showing that in the rebalancing that's happened over the past couple of months, investors are increasingly choosing to put their money back into sustainable funds rather than their conventional counterparts. And actually, AUM is up about 40% year on year. And so with that dynamic of, so much of the money flowing in the direction of sustainable funds, I think we do have, a lot of a scarcity of supply, and that is translating into, better conditions for issuers. And I absolutely agree. I think it would be irresponsible of an investor to ever say that they would accept, a lower return in exchange for, a social or green bond. But at the same time, I think what they would say is that they're getting, evidence of better risk management practices and evidence of better stakeholder engagement, which ultimately is indicating a better quality issuer. And certainly my colleagues on the syndication desk at HSBC would tell you that they have no doubt that there is, less price sensitivity in green and social bond execution than there is in conventional execution, partly because, those investors are thinking about, more long-term factors, and they themselves are buy and hold investors.
Indeed. And Simone, what are your thoughts? How can social debt finance be kind of leveraged? I mean, Farnam, I think, talked at the beginning about the fact that it's a pretty small part. ESG finance is a very small part of overall debt capital market issuance in a given year. That's it's growing, but it's still a pretty small. Within the ESG complex, it's really about environmental, sustainable, and social is a very small part of that. And so I wouldn't say it's a rounding error, but in the context of global debt issuance, it's very small. But then given all of the themes that you can issue social bonds into, and the target populations you can focus on, certainly in concept, that we should, the social bond market should be a multiple the size it is. What do you think of some of the things that we might need to get it scaled up and leveraged up into a sort of perhaps more meaningful market segment?
Yeah, it's a big question. So obviously, one thing is, we've said that before, right? We have always a lot of debates, and although there are so many ways that you could invest into a social bond, it's not always easy to agree on what counts as a social issue, or what is, what's the target population. So we at ICMA do our best, and as I said, it's mainly the social bonds working group who's working on, continuously improving things on, to make it more transparent for investors. So that's also going to increase demand if investors feel this is something where we can really see where our money is going. Makes them feel good, maybe, as well, in addition to getting a return. And because investors, they do want to, they don't just want to do well, they also want to do some good. And we've talked about the COVID-19 theme bonds. Unfortunately, of course, this is kind of a sad catalyst, but maybe this will also help, after the Paris Agreement, kind of everyone understood that there's a need to finance climate change, or to send private financing towards, lowering global emissions. This is, again, a global issue now. Everyone understands the issues with COVID-19, and maybe this will also help to serve as a catalyst. Now, the other thing, of course, we have seen in the green bonds market is that, a lot of countries, for example, have, subsidized this area. Japan, for example, they have incentivized issues. There has been regulation. The EU has also come out with the EU taxonomy. So maybe that is something, that could help in that area as well. We'll just have to see. But we at ICMA are certainly doing our best to make it more transparent, and, to keep updating our guidance. Something that also helped is we brought out an SDG mapping. So, while it might be difficult to see what is a social issue, for example, a lot of, there's a lot more consensus on what are the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that the UN brought out. And while they were brought out for countries, you can actually also apply them to the capital markets, as it turns out. So we have some guidance on our website as well, where you can see how eligible projects under the sustainability bond guidelines, for example, or the social bond principles, could actually map to the to 15 of the 17 SDGs.
Okay, thank you. Let me go back to you, Farnam. How do you think social debt finance can be kind of levered up? Do we are principles-based sort of guidelines enough? Do we need something a bit more? I'm saying rules-based. I'm not sure if I mean rules-based, but you know what I mean. Something a bit more specific and formal than a set of kind of guidelines. Much as I think the ICMA, SPP, and they're fantastic as a starting point. But if they're written more, specific guidelines, and then I guess governments on the other side putting pressure, or people putting pressure on governments to actually raise their game in this respect. But Yeah, what do you think?
I think we're building a lot of momentum right now, which will result in a longer term scaling up of the market. I think that obviously the pandemic has acted as a catalyst, but it has also, I think maybe sped up what would have eventually been the case. In any case, they've been slowly sort of tracking behind green bonds, but we've seen kind of the exponential growth in green bonds, and a lot of that I think it has to do with regulatory support. So in Europe, for instance, we have the European taxonomy, which focuses right now on the aspects of climate transition and environmental aspects, but has always had it in its thinking to expand in the longer term to social aspects as well. So I think that kind of change in regulation will act as a further catalyst. I also think, the demonstration effect is really powerful in debt markets. So as issuers see their peers issuing, I think that it demystifies it a little bit for them as well, and encourages them to move forward with it, and shows that it's not as challenging or, as burdensome as they may have thought. And also we always have a little bit of a competition going on between different issuers in different sectors, where they don't necessarily want to be the last one in the pharma sector to issue a social bond, or the last bank to issue a social bond. So I think both of those factors, the demonstration effect, the focus of regulators, and finally I would say investor focus as well. I think when we talk to investors about the social bond market, and actually within the social bonds working group, we did a survey earlier this year, pre-COVID, on what would encourage more investment in the social bond market. And I think the small size of it up until this year was a deterrent for some investors, because it was very difficult to build strategies or funds around a market that was up until this year less than about 40 billion in total outstanding. So I think that's also going to be a catalyst for longer term growth of the market.
Indeed. So yes, you heard of HSBC. You don't want to be the last to issue a social bond. But
we have issued a sustainability bond, but I hope we won't be the last to issue.
I'm just kidding.
But I think maybe I also just add to this one that this is of course also something that has been discussed within the green bond market. What can be done to scale up like the green financing, and I think here the definition and figure out what is green, where I think like within Europe at least, the EU taxonomy will help a lot with when we get a more like definition of what the green is with the taxonomy. And I think that for the social part, that's more difficult, because what is social in one part of the world might not be social in another one. So some of our peers, for example, they have issued like education bonds where you finance schools, when a lot of our listeners are coming from the emerging market, where if we finance a school in the Nordics, it's maybe not as social, because access to education here is very high and very easy. So for us, for financing education, will maybe not in our definition category as social here. I think then it would be more about like the quality of the, and that can be difficult to measure. We do it with hospitals. There is some quality measure for hospitals. How can you get a good hospital, and you can measure that, and maybe also with the university. But there is also something you can do with schools. But I think it's more difficult, and I think that's the problem that compared to the green bond market maybe.
Yeah. So on the asset side, is how much of your business on the lending side is within your core countries, and how much do you do outside? 95%
is within our member countries.
Okay.
So that's the main part. Yeah.
Yeah. No, fair enough. But there are a few questions that are coming up as we've been speaking. So I'm just going to take 1 second, if I may, just to quickly look at some of the questions to see if I can get some of those out to you. Well, I guess one is how are investors reacting to these bonds? Perhaps you can perhaps answer that one, Farnam, which is a general question. Do social bonds generate impact? Are there any case studies? I think Simone, you mentioned the IFC case study, I think. So perhaps you can talk to that. One of the questions says, in the Netherlands, Europe, we see a growing demand from industry, government and public for rules-based impacts for good, sustainable social investment. What do you see as next steps to accelerate this? Yeah, perhaps it's a difficult one to answer, but we'll leave it there for now. So, generally, I mean, we covered it to an extent, but Farnam, how are investors reacted to COVID-19 in social bonds?
I think they've been very receptive, and we've seen, not just in the context of the social bonds working group, the investors involved there, but separately, as I mentioned, we've seen, APG and PIMCO and AXA all come out with sort of their own guidelines and essentially calls for more issuance in this space. I think there's a view from investors that it's sort of the right tool for the time, that as we look at the market post COVID, there needs to be more transparency with regards to use of proceeds and a clearer impact of the financing that's being done. So I think you've seen the results of it in the order books themselves. A lot of issuers that have issued in this space have seen record order books. The Council of Europe saw their largest ever order book. The World Bank and Sterling saw their largest ever order books. I think that shows you the amount of investor support for these issuances.
Cool. And Simone, in terms of case studies and impact generation, I think did you make reference to the IFC, because they've done their social impact reporting is I think been quite good and quite instructive. Did you refer to that earlier?
Yeah, so what I referred to in relation to the IFC earlier was the case studies in terms of if you want to issue a social bond, so what could the proceeds go to, for example, and what SDGs could it be aligned to, and so on. Okay. But the IFC is actually also a good example for impact reporting. So they come out with a report every year, because they obviously they've been doing this since 2017. They're also chairing our social bonds working group, and they're very active, and the impact reports are very good. Now, in general, we have some guidance on the website, the harmonized handbook on impact reporting. And that's something that's very important to investors. So they want to know how has their money been allocated, but then also what has been achieved. And what you should actually say as an issuer is, what are the outputs? So that's something, practices, products, and services that result from the project. So something like, the number of dwellings built would be an example. Then you should also talk about actual outcomes that are achieved as a result of the output. So that could be, if you look at the rent, for example. So if you put more affordable housing out there, what I just said, build more dwellings, and you should also give the number for that. Then that should actually an outcome could be that the rental costs compared to the national or regional rent index are going down. And then you should also talk about the actual impact achieved. Now, that might not occur until several years after the project, but that would ultimately be something like, a reduction in homelessness. So that's something that investors are very interested, and you should be very transparent about that. And you should also, where possible, put this, just put this into quantitative criteria. So, and also quantitative outcomes, output and impact. So give actual numbers. Also relate those numbers to your target population. So how many within your target population have benefited from this, if possible. Qualitative information is good as well, but quantitative actual numbers are always better. So that's something that's very important, and investors are putting a lot of emphasis on this, actually. It's expected from issuers to have an annual impact report.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, thanks. The question here, where can we find the IFC case studies? I think you'll find them fairly prominently on the IFC website, but I think also available for the IFC as well. Is that right, Simone? The IFC case study?
It's 3 case studies. Yeah, there's going to be more, but the actual impact report by the IFC and other issuers would be on the respective website of the issuers.
Okay, Farnam, there's a question here, which is there a mechanism for SMEs to access this finance directly? And I guess that goes back to a fair amount of microfinance sort of social bond issuance. But is SMEs an area that you see growing? And how does, I mean, presumably that's just down to the, I guess, the lenders themselves raising finance and then on lending to SMEs, right?
That's exactly right. So what we're seeing is financial institutions issuing COVID response bonds, and as a use of proceeds, using their SME portfolios, and then committing to report on that and how many SMEs have benefited, and potentially also using proxy methodologies to report on the number of people who've had their jobs maintained or preserved. So this is something that we see featured both in the social bond frameworks of development banks like ECO and Cassa di Depositi in Italy, but also private banks and commercial banks. We recently saw the first issuance in Europe from BBVA of a COVID-19 response bond, which was largely focused on SME finance.
Right. Okay, Ash, I'm going to stay with you, Farnam. There's a question here, which I guess is one for you, which is as follows. Is there more interest from family offices than pension funds, reflecting the fact that high net worth individuals can play with their money more than the average man in the street with his pension?
So it's an interesting question, and I think it goes back to the point that Jens made, which is that actually the growth in this market has come from the more mainstream investors becoming more active, rather than just family offices and boutique asset managers, which was maybe the case a couple of years ago. Here in the UK, a massive catalyst for the growth of ESG has been the fact that pension funds are now required to have a responsible investing policy. And that's, I think, encourage them or incentivize them to start looking at green and social bonds, given that you are getting the same credit quality of the issuer, and you're not taking on undue risk related to the projects themselves, but rather just getting that additional transparency from the social and green bond frameworks. Yeah,
okay. Thanks. Like, I'm conscious of our time, but kind of more at the end of our session. And I think we covered a lot of ground and hit a lot of the high points. So before we close, I just wanted to ask each of the our fine distinguished speakers to give maybe a closing comment about the future of social debt finance within the institutional capital markets ecosystem, from your own perspectives and standpoints. Simone, if you had to give a closing statement, just a short summary of your perspectives, your thoughts, your hopes, maybe your dreams. I don't know.
Yeah, I would really like to hope that there's going to be more institutions going forward issuing social bonds. As I've mentioned before, we have already seen a lot of sovereigns, supranational agencies, multilateral development banks, but I would really hope that, especially with all the good work that we do with our social bonds working group, that this helps corporate issuers understand this market better and issue more in this area. And we've discussed this a lot, but we have seen a remarkable increase or surge in social bonds. If we just think back, the green bond market has been around for much longer, and just in the short of space that we've had, we have actually achieved a lot in the social bonds space. So I would hope this is going to continue. Hopefully, it's going to continue after COVID-19, but it's also great to see that this has become such a useful instrument to alleviate some of these socioeconomic consequences of this terrible pandemic that we're all going through at the moment.
Absolutely. And yeah, from your standpoint, you've been very clear about your perspectives, but just to give a kind of closing statement.
Maybe I will just say again what I said before. I think the future will be much more on the ESG analysis of the whole issue. Of course, like the green and the social bonds is helping to a large extent, but I think it's very important that investors look at the whole issue as from an ESG point of view. So I think that will be much more important. And I think, in fact, the COVID has been a catalyst for maybe transforming this analysis a little bit, because it's to a large extent been on the E, but I think the S and the G will be much more important going forward. So I think that's what we will see going forward.
Okay, thanks. If I just one thing I did forget to ask, perhaps to give your closing statement by all means, but also Is there a risk that COVID-19 response bonds, whether labelled, unlabelled, SDG or not, kind of like overwhelm and sort of emasculate other aspects of social finance in the immediate term? Perhaps you can answer that and then give your closing statement.
Actually, it does relate to what I want to say in my closing statement, which is, beyond echoing Simone and Jens's comments, I think, in effect, we'll really know the impact of what's happened in a year's time when we start to see the impact reporting from all of these issuances. And then we can start to quantify, yes, we've seen record amounts of issuance, but what has been the outcome and what has that meant in terms of beneficiaries? And I think that's also how we make sure that the COVID-19 response bonds act as, an accelerant and a catalyst for the broader social bond market and don't necessarily overwhelm it. Because if you have, the continuation of good practice in terms of allocation and impact reporting, you can really use those bonds to show how it can be done in times where we're not necessarily in such an acute crisis. And so we'll see in a year's time, and I hope and I dream that it's going to be the case.
Very good. Okay, so I think that's probably it from me. So I'm hoping that Prasant is somewhere in the vicinity. He's going to come back and take us out to our close. Oh, there he is. There he is.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you so much for the interesting panel. Actually, I would like to thank our panel of experts for joining us today and for taking time out from your schedule and sharing your thoughts and perspective with us. I would like to also thank our multilateral partner, Islamic Cooperation for the Development of the Private Sector, for sponsoring today's webinar. I would like to thank our audience for joining us and for sharing their questions. The link to today's webinar video will be sent to you via email. We're also conducting a short survey to get your feedback on today's webinar. The link of the survey will be shared with you via the chat and via email. To register for our next webinar scheduled for the 8th of June 2020, please visit our website, www.aimcongress.com/webinars. Also follow us on our social media channels to keep yourself updated. Thank you all once again. Thank you to our speakers for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.